Welcome to Jammin' with Jason Mefford, a show where we discuss topics relevant to chief audit executives and professionals in audit, risk, and compliance. We discuss the technical and soft skills needed to navigate the minefields of organizations. You hear best practices and practical advice for helping you advance your career, and we'll even talk about music, mindfulness, and psychology, because we can. So sit back and relax while you listen to the #1 podcast in the world for internal auditors, unscripted and unedited. Hey, I am very, very honored today to have Tim Leech with me. And I'm telling you, if you don't already know who Tim Leech is, then shame on you, because if you've been in this industry for any amount of time, you should know who he is. And I wanted to bring Tim on today, and kind of introduce him a little bit. He has been around the industry for a long time. And one of the reasons that I love Tim and wanted to talk to him is we both like the word contrarians, or we are often kind of viewed as contrarians. And I love the message that Tim brings and that he shares with people. And I'm hoping, as we go through and talk today, because there's a few things that I wanted to make sure that we talked about, that it will help many of you kind of understand and solidify and gel some of these things that people like Tim have been talking about for 30 plus years, but people still aren't getting it. Okay. So Tim, welcome, my friend. I'm actually very honored as well to have you with me. So how you doing, man?
Well, thanks for having me, and I appreciate you reaching out to find out about my quote contrarian views.
I was going to say it's funny because there's a few of us in the industry. We were talking before about people like Norman too, where we say what's on our mind and what we think people need to hear, but it often doesn't toe the party line, if you will. And so, people that don't, preach the religion or toe the party line sometimes kind of get pushed off to the side. And but the message that you have, because you talk a lot about objective-centric. And so, I wanted to kind of get in and, because you've also had enough time in your career that you've seen all of the history and the back and the forth. But maybe let's kind of start off talking a little bit about, what is an objective-centric approach. And I know you said before that sometimes talking about the other 4 centric approaches, because there's kind of 5 approaches, helps people really kind of understand what the difference is with taking an objective-centric approach versus some of these other approaches.
Yeah, I think the notion of, I'm happy to explain the notion of objective-centric, but also, introduce the others. But it's fair to say that my entire career has been focused on convincing the world that organizations, both public and private sector, would be better off if they aspired to strong first line, objective-centric assurance that integrates all of the efforts of the first, second, third, and in the framework we promote, we consider senior executives to be the 4th line and the board of directors to be the 5th line. Mm-hmm. So I have actively, if you were to Google 5 lines of assurance, you'd find all kinds of articles from Tim Leech promoting 5 lines of assurance. But at a 30,000 foot level, my whole career has been defined by the belief that organizations would run more effectively and be better for stakeholders, including shareholders, if all of the lines would coordinate their efforts around the most important objectives that the entity needs to achieve. Mm-hmm. And that has been the guiding principle, if you will, from 1985 on, when we launched control self-assessment at Gulf Canada. So it's not just about objective-centric. The reason I am so big on objective-centric is if you want If you believe that management is responsible for managing risk, I've always just said, how can you not believe that management should be able to assess whether their current choices right now are any good or not? So,
It's kind of part of the whole management process,
yeah,
right?
so, very early on, I would sometimes make jokes at large conferences, and I had clients that I would say to them, look, I don't mean this in an offensive way, but the reality is the more and the better audits you do, the less management thinks they need to learn how to do an assessment of their own situation.
Hmm.
Somebody that you're going to come along and do it for them, and you're going to tell management the parts you don't like. And as long as you're good with a weak first line approach to risk management, that's what traditional auditing does. Is it assumes, it literally assumes management has not done an assessment. Otherwise, the first question you would always ask is, we're here to audit topic X. We've decided it's worth $100,000 internal audit. Fair enough. Wouldn't you think management would have done a self-assessment if it's that important to the company that audit's going to spend resources
To
and
come in
time
and look at it.
looking at it?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because as you said it that way too, it's almost because I'm always interested in the psychology and the human behavior behind it, right? Is that, and the IA has their 3 lines of defense. Now it's a 3 lines model, whatever, blah, 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 right? That actually internal audit subconsciously would probably prefer a weaker first line because it gives us a reason to have a job, right?
Well, in the early days when we were promoting the mantra of control, risk, self-assessment, which is fundamentally a strong first line model, we would have old guard internal auditors that would literally get up right in the middle of the presentation and say, this is nothing to do with, why would I teach management how to do that? What will there be for us to do? And I said, oh my God, these are people that are in chief internal audit positions that are saying they actually prefer management to be unaware so that they'd have plenty of findings.
It sounds
And I'm
pretty
not
silly
making,
to say, but that's what they're saying, right?
I'm not making the story up. It happened at IIA conferences, and it took quite a lot of convincing in the early 90s to convince the IIA that teaching management how to better manage risks to their most important objectives should really be seen as a core part of internal audit's job.
Mm-hmm.
It's not seen as a core part of most internal audit jobs. And so that's what we proposed at Gulf Canada, and CEO bought into it, and hundreds of clients around the world that I've worked with since I went into public practice in way back in I guess 1987. I came and set up the control and risk management services practice for Coopers and Lybrand in Toronto. And that practice was a mix of forensic accounting, control risk self-assessment, fraud vulnerability ethics, but all of it's on that whole. The IIA took a position for quite a while. They set up the CCSA certification,
Mm-hmm.
and actually did champion for a while, but never really got any support, and that designation's largely gone.
Well, it is
And
gone now. They're not offering it anymore.
yeah, and what's been replaced by is the CRMA, but the CRMA doesn't teach them. If you go in and management is not trained, not capable, and isn't doing self-assessments of their own, you should give them a D report on the quality of their risk management framework.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how can you consider a risk management framework to be truly effective if management receives no training how to identify risks, is not expected to regularly identify and actually write down what are the risks to their most important objectives, and doesn't know how to line up risk treatments with those.
Mhm.
How can you consider a risk framework effective if that's the case? And the reality is if you look at the IIA materials and you look at their most recent guidance on how to assess the effectiveness, they do propose a maturity scale. Go and read the maturity scale, and you will realize that level 4 and 5 actually do say, hey, these are scenarios where management actually knows how to assess risk and is doing it. So that's level 5 is called optimized in that framework. So when the IIA put that out, I said to them, well, help me out here. I'm a simple guy. Does that mean if you're at level 1 and 2, you have an ineffective control framework? Can you have a truly effective framework that is at the lowest level of maturity if it's in a high change rate environment? Nowhere in that guidance does it say. So it says, okay, let's forget about whether it's effective or not. Let's just report whether it's what level of maturity. And I said, no, 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 no. If I'm on the board of directors, I want to know. Say we're level 2. Is level 2 effective or ineffective? Telling me that I'm at level 2 out of 5 doesn't help me.
No, and that's one of the problems that maturity models have in general. Usually, is again, it's like, well, is 1 okay, or is it not okay?
Is 5 what we should aspire to,
or not? And again, so they're so nebulous in that way that it doesn't ever get back to the effectiveness, like you said.
Well, and if you read the guidance, it says big motherhood things like everybody should tailor their program for their unique circumstances. But make no mistake, Standard 2120 says internal auditors should report on the effectiveness of the risk management process. It doesn't say internal auditors should report what level of the
Maturity
5 levels we're at. That's not what it says.
Yeah.
So you're really side-slipping the fundamental requirement in the standard by saying you don't have to actually say whether it's effective or ineffective or appropriate or inappropriate. All you have to do is say it's a 2.5 out of 5 and show them on the little sliding scale how that works.
Well, but even the 2.5 out of 5, it's like, again, it's like 2.7 versus 2.8. No, it's a 5-step scale. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I like to give them credit where credit's due, and levels 4 and 5 are actually describing stronger and stronger first line risk management.
Yep.
So implicitly they are saying, except they never actually said 4 and 5 is better. They just said that it's more mature. So, and I'm not talking out of school. I write these comments directly to the IIA when I read exposure drafts, and I regularly pound on these principles when I'm talking. I correspond, I send my posts all the time to this year's global chair, Janitha John, who did the working group chair of the new 3 lines model.
Yep.
And the 3 lines model is the closest thing yet that the IIA has produced that says the first line should actually assess and report.
Yeah.
But they said assess and report on risk, and I wrote them and said, I really wish you'd said certainty of achieving objectives.
Well, because that's the point where you and I, agree so much on this, is that everybody just wants to use the word risk without really realizing what we're trying to do when we're managing risk, which goes back to that uncertainty of objectives, right?
Yeah, and Norman Marks has been banging that gong. We really have not seen the IIA come out with any clarity and suggest that internal auditors should actually articulate and write down during the auditing planning process just what are the most important objectives of the corporation. And most recently, I wrote a blog post because they just issued a new way of doing assurance universes. They They
Doesn't
didn't
make
propose
sense.
that it start with the most important objectives.
No.
They said they're going to use risk categories.
Yeah. Well, and which is why, again, I think maybe let's kind of take us back to these 5 different centric approaches, because I think this is going to hopefully help people. Because same thing, when I read that document that you're referring to, yeah, there was some nice talk about objectives in there a little bit from a risk standpoint, but then it's just focusing on the risks, not tying back to objectives, but it's still going right back to a process level audit universe. And there's no linkage between the two. So let's kind of go through, because you usually teach people and talk about 5 different centric kind of focused approaches. So let's kind of go through those, just talk a little bit about each one so people can really kind of understand the difference with what objective centric really means.
Sure, I think it's a foundation building block. For the last 25 years, when I run training courses, I always include a module on so that the people in the class get the idea of the different ways you can approach the task of giving assurance. So the 5 methods, very simply, are: the oldest is compliance centric. An organization writes rules, writes policies. Uh, Even back in the old days, when I used to get an audit program to go out and audit a refinery, there would be a whole set of things. Thou shalt do X. Okay, let's go audit whether they're doing X. Well, who decided they should do X? Well, there's a policy that says they should do X. Fair enough. So that was the oldest form of auditing, is you would go out and you'd set of rules that somebody had decided in their wisdom were important to do, and the auditors would verify that those rules were being followed. So that's what I call compliance centric. Process centric was when I joined Coopers and Lybrand in 1979 to become an external auditor. Coopers and Lybrand taught process centric auditing. They would taught you to study the revenue cycle, the disbursement cycle. They had all different ones that they would consider processes, and you would work your way through the process, flow chart it, and you would identify what you called key controls in the process. And so that was the earliest form. But the notion is that no matter what you're doing, so in your house at home, you have a process to acquire food. You can think of that as a process, right?
Yep.
You could flow chart it. How do we decide what we want to eat next week? What are the steps? And you could flow chart that. And you could then decide, are there flaws in the process? So, but the emphasis was on documenting the process. And then risk centric, which has come into vogue. The IIA uses the words risk-centric regularly and has for the last 15, 20 years. The idea is we can be more than compliance police. We should look at the biggest risks to the company. However, the process used to decide what are the biggest risks usually started in the audit room with a bunch of auditors sitting around saying, what do we think are the biggest risks? The process that they used to decide that rarely started by saying, first, let's agree what the company's biggest and most important objectives are. It just didn't.
Yep.
So that's risk-centric. Risk-centric is you go in a room and you ask a bunch of people in the room, what do you see as the biggest risks to the company, to the department, to the project? People will make up in their own mind what they think the objectives are, and they'll start telling you what they think risks are. But it often does not start by saying, before you answer that, let's write down what are the 10 most important objectives that must be accomplished by the company, the department, the subsidiary. It rarely does that.
No.
So that's risk-centric. And it's done in all different ways, but risk registers are the purest form, where you're asking people this question, what do you see as the biggest risks? And you're parking them all in, quote, a register. And then you're putting red, ambers, and greens, and you're doing likelihood and consequences. but rarely is there an answer to which objectives are most, quote, at risk of not being achieved as a result of the way we're managing the risks to an objective. And so that's risk-centric. Control-centric, a lot of people haven't had much experience with, but it's actually evaluating your controls against an accepted control model. And Canada built one in the 80s called the Criteria of Control, COCO for short. United States came along with the first COSO, internal control financial reporting framework. Don't correct me if I'm wrong. I'm thinking it was around 2003 was when COSO, let me think.
Well, they did the
Canada
original
was
one in
mid-90s.
Yeah, I think they did the original COSO in 92.
Well, there was history there.
Yeah, and then they did the update with, what was it? Yeah, it was like 2003 or something.
Yeah, they treat the history of COSO was Treadway Commission went and studied what went wrong. One of the Treadway Commission's findings was that nobody agreed what the words internal control meant. So Treadway became, the sponsors of Treadway are in fact the founding members of COSO. So Treadway morphed into COSO, and COSO then turned out the very first effort, which in my mind was significantly less useful than the Canadian 4-category 20-element model. The first effort at COSO was a 5-category. And a lot of people don't know that the actual exposure draft of the first COSO was a 9-category model that was genius. The authors were Coopers and Librand, and it actually did say objectives were the most important category.
Oh, we have lost to history.
Yeah, in between, and I've written about this at length. I have all of the details, like with the quotes. And so the original exposure draft of COSO actually said you should have objectives and you should measure whether you're achieving them. The final 5-category framework that was released around whatever that date was, 202, 203, all gone. So we went back to old speak with words like control environment and communication, which was vague. It didn't say you should measure anything. It just said you should communicate stuff. But if you go back and you look at the exposure draft, I was so excited about that exposure draft. I thought it was genuine breakthrough thinking. And it got hammered back into audit speak by the time the final product got released. But so COSO came out with a 5-category, and the elements you actually had to try and figure out yourself. That they were kind of written, but they weren't nice and crisp and clear. Like the Canadian one was a 4-category, 20 criteria. COSO was 5 categories, no doubt about that. But what were the sub-elements of those 5 categories? It was kind of vague, and I made them up. So I actually converted it into probably about a 70 or 80 element model under the 5 categories. So that's what I call control-centric. You're taking a framework that somebody says is good, but we can look at things like the Malcolm Baldrige quality framework. We can look at other models that even COBIT is in essence a control-centric framework. It's saying you should be doing this bunch of stuff. So anybody that writes a framework that says you will look good if you do these things. So now when they updated the COSO framework, they did actually turn it into a 20-category.
Yeah.
So it's
much
still
more
5
like
categories,
COCO now.
but now it's got principles. So the principles are the sub-elements. And so that's control criteria. So if you were to use that, you would actually describe to your audit committee how you look or don't look like the model that you're using as the framework to report against. So you'd say, do we measure up against? So Sarbanes-Oxley actually requires an opinion against the COSO internal control framework.
Mhm.
Now, most auditors skip that step and never really give you one, but it literally says in the words that they're looking for an opinion against a suitable framework.
Right.
They define what a suitable framework is, but everybody used COSO. They said you could use the Canadian framework or
Well,
the
because
British framework, but
yeah, because in one, I think paper, one letter back from somebody at the SEC, they said, well, COSO's an example of one of them, like we mean. And everybody's like, oh, okay, well, yeah, but you can use any of them.
well, and the reality is you know the big four accounting firms are U.S. centric, and the requirement for Sarbanes-Oxley to report an opinion against a control framework um, required all of the largest companies in the world that access the U.S. securities markets for capital
Mhm.
to have opinions whether they are or are not in accordance with COSO, first from the CEO and CFO, and then independently from the external auditor. So that's a control criteria model. Objective-centric says, let's start by agreeing what are the organizations or the department or the subsidiaries' top most important value creation objectives. These are the things that are going to make us great, drive us forward. And what are the most important value preservation? Value preservation, not going to make you great, but if you don't do them well, it'll take you into the ditch and destroy your value of your company and your shareholders. So nobody's going to ever win the company of the year because they publish fabulous financial statements. But if they publish materially wrong financial statements,
It's not good.
it's not good. And,
Yeah.
and the same goes with data security. You lose all your customers' social security numbers and credit card numbers and all their personal health data. It's bad. But, you know, protecting it wasn't going to make you a great hospital. So that's what objective-centric is. So we have encouraged people, and on our website, on the resources page, you can download a nice 15-page summary description of the 5 methods. And we encourage people to actually inventory what is your internal audit department. So I actually encourage audit committee chairmen to ask the CAE, what percentage of these 5 methods do you use in doing your audit work? So I want you to take all of the hours that the audit department puts in. Which combination of these 5 methods are you using? And the reality in most audit shops, the one they use least or perhaps not at all is objective-centric.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a, I use a different term just because everybody had been talking about risk-based auditing. So I've been using the term risk-based internal auditing, but it's really what you're talking about from the objective-centric standpoint is what are the key objectives, and we go from there, right? And everything that's on your audit plan, in my opinion, should probably come from there. But I think it's interesting how you said here too, that I want to kind of bring up for people is if you look at your audit plan, right, how much of it is compliance centric, how much of it is process centric, how much of it is control centric or risk centric, or really goes back to the objective. Because there is, the reality is we have to do some compliance things, we might have to do some control things just as an expectation. But to me, really the process and risk even flows from the objective, right? Is that if we really understand what our most important value creation or value preservation objectives are, then the risks and the processes that we need to look at are going to flow from that.
Yeah, and one of the things that we make very clear is that one of the fundamental flaws in risk registers is that they take risks that relate to many, many objectives and they plunk them into a register in isolation. Well, if you took your home and you said, well, one of the risks is that occupants are unaware of that there's a fire, and then you put it in a risk register and you put high, mediums, and low on it, and you decide there's going to be a risk owner. but nobody in the house is responsible for safeguarding the health and safety of the occupants against injury and death. So unfortunately, and one of the things that I've actually done this. I go in and to a traditional company where the audit department has been doing 20, 30, 50, 100 audits a year. You can reverse engineer them, and you say which objectives are implied in the work that was done on this audit. So you reverse engineer and you say, well, you wouldn't look at that control if there wasn't an objective to do XYZ. So you reverse the thing, and what those tests have always shown me is very few internal audit departments have gone anywhere near the most important value creation objectives. Most of the audit plans are around value preservation and traditional type objectives. And when you say, look, I've just finished reading the strategic plan that went to the board, show me what percentage of your internal audit plan next year is specific on those objectives.
Most of the time, and when I've asked those, it's even zero.
Yeah, it can be, and but my attitude is, I've always promoted. I've used the term supply driven. Most internal auditing done in the world is supply driven. The internal audit department locks up, decides what they're going to audit, runs it by the audit committee, who are busy and don't really care. I've hardly, in the hundreds of clients I've worked with over the years, the number of really insightful feedback from an audit committee or a senior leadership team on the audit plan is rarely much. And I don't blame them for that. They're busy people. So they just sort of say, unless this is going to bother me a whole lot and inconvenience my staff, you go ahead and do those audits.
Mm-hmm.
And I encourage audit committees to become demand driven. I say, look, that audit department you've got costs $5 million. Why don't you actually take the time as an audit committee to agree what it is you want them to do in terms of outcomes? Like, let's agree what those are. Mm-hmm. So before I try and assess the effectiveness of your $5 million internal audit department, I want the customers to tell me what is it they most want from the $5 million in terms of outcomes. Mm-hmm. And the reality is if in fact the reality is they only want the audit department to pacify regulators and to pacify and keep the external auditors okay, and they don't really expect the internal audit department will ever go anywhere near the most important risks. Fair enough. At least we've got it in black and white that says internal audit department is not to look at the most important objectives of the company. It's not your domain. If that's the decision, that's fine. But don't let the internal audit department continue saying they're auditing the top risks when they're not going anywhere near the top objectives.
Well, and I think it's interesting, the way you just put that is using supply driven and demand driven for your audit plans. I think it's a great way that hopefully that kind of hits people too, is, when you're just kind of picking and deciding what you think needs to be on the audit report or in the audit plan, like we talked about, usually it's kind of an echo chamber in ourselves. We might ask input from a few people, but we just pretty much put down what we want to do. Audit committee rubber stamps it. That's supply driven. That's what we want to do. And actually getting the input and allowing the audit plan to be demand driven by what the executives and the board really want is a totally different thing. Now, I know, and that's what I encourage people to do as well. It's like, if you want to be relevant, go figure out what actually makes you relevant. It's what the people need or want. But I get a lot of people that push back and go, but if they're telling me what to do, then I'm no longer independent and objective.
Well, if it in fact it is the board of directors that's telling what to do, I would counsel you not to be independent because they're paying your money.
They're
So if
paying the
you've
money.
decided I'm going to go do whatever I want, regardless of what any of my customers actually after they've been asked to think about it. But on our website on the resource page, there's a 5-step overview of Objective-centric. And the first step is to agree what are the most important value creation and value preservation objectives. And we want the leadership team to decide who in management owns each of those objectives. What level of risk assessment rigor do we want to analyze the risk and the certainty of achieving those objectives? So that's what we call risk certainty assessment rigor. And do we want independent assurance from internal audit on the representation on the state of risk and certainty from internal audit? The answer is no. So that step literally defines the entire work plan for the risk department, if there is one, and for the internal audit department. However, it assumes that the company has accepted the business case for a strong first line, because it's saying the primary assessor reporter will be the management that own the objective. They will be the primary assessor reporters. The risk department will help them do that and put some discipline over it and provide editorial comments on the product. And if it's decided that internal audit has a role as an independent assurance provider, it's not internal audit's job to say whether they like the controls or not. It's internal audit's job to say, has the representation been accurately described in terms of where the weaknesses are, where the strengths are, and how that links to current performance being produced on those objectives. So it's a very simple diagram. It's 5 steps, and it literally defines what a demand-driven process looks like and what an objective-centric. So if you want strong first line, if you believe that strong first line risk governance will be more nimble, more agile is a big word out there. Everybody wants to say we're agile. How can you be agile if we're waiting for the second and third line to report there might be big problems here?
We can't.
No.
We can't.
So if you're going to want to be an agile company, you better be a strong first line company. Well, how are you going to be a strong first line company? You're going to be a strong first line company if management believes they are expected to be able to identify and measure the risks and think in a thoughtful way about how to respond to those risks to increase the certainty important objectives will be achieved.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's, I want to be conscious of time too, because we try to keep the podcast. I could talk to you for like 2 or 3 hours, man. But I wanted to maybe hit on one other thing here, and then we're going to probably need to kind of wrap it up for today. But I get a lot of people that when I'm talking about objective-centric, and I'm sure you've gotten this question over your whole career, is we talked about how a lot of times audits staying away from it, probably because they prefer to focus on what's comfortable for them, what they've done in the past, right? What the history has kind of been, instead of jumping in and looking at what really are the most important objectives in the organization. And I get a lot of people that say, well, I don't do that because I don't know what they are. Right. So what do you say to people? I know you're laughing now. Okay. Right. But when an auditor says, well, but I don't know what the objectives are, so how can I audit those objectives? Or when I find out what those objectives are, I don't know what to do with it. It's too high level, and I'm supposed to be auditing the processes, right? I hear this all the time. So
that's why we like to give the orientation on the methodologies to the senior leadership team and the audit committee and risk committees. What do they want from internal audit? Do they want a bunch of compliance checking on low-level processes, or do they want opinions and input and help fundamentally, do they want internal audit to help management manage the certainty that the most important objectives will be achieved? And if the answer is yes, then audit has to radically change the way it's done in a large number of organizations today.
Yep.
If the answer is no, we just want to be able to say we have an audit department. I used to go in a $5 million audit budget a year, and they'd be thinking about outsourcing it to Coopers and Lybrand. And I'd say, well, what's your budget? It's 5 million. And I'd say to them, well, I can do it for half. The client would sort of, what do you mean? How could you possibly say you don't even know what they're doing? And I said, it's not so much whether I know what they're doing. It's that I am almost certain you haven't told them with any clarity what outcomes you want from them. And as long as the primary reason for their existence is to say we have an audit department that does audits, that write audit reports, I can do audits and I can write audit reports for $2.5 million.
Yeah.
You've been paying $5 million for people doing audits and doing audit reports. How did you know you shouldn't have been paying 10? Because you don't know and have not told them what specific things you want an opinion on. So in the absence of clarity of what it is you want from that internal audit function, we could, hey, look, if you're feeling you want even bigger savings, let's pare it down to $1.5 million. That'll be a decent assignment for me. Mm-hmm. We'll do just as many audit reports as they were doing before. Mm-hmm. And you'll be able to say Coopers and Lybrand is now doing your audits, and they're a world-class firm with incredibly deep resources that can be called to audit the most significant risks a company can face. So, I don't like to make fun of it, but the reality is, and when I have this discussion with audit committee chairs who I often golf with and socialize with, they know it's true. Mm-hmm. So, but here's the rub. What's the biggest metric that internal audit departments use? Percentage of audit plan covered. Mm-hmm. Well, how bad an outcome statement is that? That's like measuring a salesman on the number and the quality of their sales calls, but without any clarity on how many sales you want them to make. So, one of the first things I do when I get called into audit to do an assessment of the effectiveness of an audit department, I will spend the time and drive out of the senior leadership team and the board. What is it you want from the $5 million you're spending? If you can define what it is you want, I can give you an idea of how many resources it will take to do it. However, if you say, I just want to be able to say we have an audit department, we have a chief audit executive, and we do audits, and the audits are reported to the leadership team and the board, pick a number and we'll all work to it. Mm-hmm. Because there's no intellectual integrity around how many resources you need unless there is clarity on the outcome sought.
Ding, 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 right? And that's the whole, especially now. So anybody who's listening that's a head of audit someplace, did you just hear how easy Tim made it sound to get your whole group outsourced and you out of a job? If you're not kind of answering that question, is what does the board and the executives really expect from internal audit? And again, it's a difficult time for some people, for some organizations, and they may choose to take hey, Tim, come in and do it for 1.5 instead of 5, right? And ultimately, it's the company's prerogative on what to do. But I can tell you, if you've been doing a supply-driven audit plan, you're at risk. You're at risk.
Be careful now. It'll be called a risk-based supply-driven audit.
Risk-based supply, right? And really, to be relevant, we have to understand what the objectives are of the organization, those top objectives, and then start helping with them, right? Because if not, we're just checking the box. Somebody else can check the box much cheaper. In fact, today I was just reading an article about auditors is one of the jobs that the World Economic Forum expects to be outsourced to machines within about 5 or 6 years.
Well, certainly if it's compliance centric or even control centric, though both of those methods are extremely amenable to artificial intelligence.
Yep.
Risk-based, you can certainly use the software that I built. You could wire up key risk indicators and escalation triggers and all of those things, and it would all be done by machines and set off alarms on dashboards.
Yep.
All of that is possible, but what I believe is very difficult to do, because it requires judgment on acceptability of certainty of achieving objectives, is that that really, if the audit department has been instructed by the leadership team and the board that they are to provide independent assurance on the reliability of information they get on objectives number 2, 6, 9, 14, and 18, and they want medium level assurance on the reliability of those data sets, I think you can do a much more rational approach in terms of how many resources do I need to do that? And in the absence of any clarity on what it is the leadership and the board want, I mean, I'm speaking from experience. I've had clients that they were outsourcing $250,000 to Deloitte. They would do 8 audits a year. And then they would say in their annual report, we have an internal audit department. They are doing risk-based internal auditing, and they're delivering 5 reports. They don't actually mention 5 because it sounds bad, but
yeah, reports.
The reports to that are going to the board and to the leadership team, and management is taking appropriate actions as required. Well, that's fine, but I'm going into a client right now that was outsourcing 5 audits a year. So what I'm saying to them is if you go with a strong first line objective centric, we can cover far more objectives for the amount of money you are spending on 5 audits, because we're going to use training and facilitation as our primary vehicle to do this, with some quality assurance if it's felt to be worthwhile by the leadership team and or the board. So this is all about making it demand driven. Once, unfortunately, the vast majority of internal audit in the world is supply driven, and it's extremely vulnerable to being outsourced right now. In a tough environment where the regulator hasn't really defined with any clarity what they want, you can argue that some of the better financial regulators have at least some idea of what they expect as outcomes from internal audit. Not usually very good, but the point is to take the time, clarify what outcomes you seek from whatever amount of money you're going to spend on the activity, and then work to the outcome, resource it to the level of outcome. And if that number is too high, change the specifications and delete objective number 4 and 7, and just go with clarity. There is no independent assurance on those objectives. Don't pretend that 5 audits a year is going to really assure that the company has an effective risk and control framework.
Yeah, it can't. It possibly can't.
And I see sometimes the stuff out of the IIA talking about benchmarking how big your audit department is against the other audit departments. Well, all of that is irrelevant if none of the departments have defined what it is they want from them in those companies.
Yeah, benchmarks are another one that I don't understand. It's like little boys pulling out a tape measure, and it's like, okay, it doesn't make any sense.
If back in my C&L days, which is now PwC, you go in and you say, we can use our vast global resources and compare how you're doing your internal auditing against the way other companies. But that's not helpful if it turns out the whole of the internal auditing sector hasn't been very effective and
Yeah.
has not been measuring outcomes, it's been measuring inputs.
Mhm.
So you got to get out of first, you got to get agreement. What outcomes do you seek from the investment in the function? And unfortunately, the IIA quality assurance review does not demand that as the first step of a QA review. And I believe unequivocally it should. So, that's key. And so demand driven, objective centric with the philosophy that strong first line is a goal. Those are my guiding principles. And I just slide through decade after decade with my belief that those are things that are important. But here's the rub. Nobody has debated with me that I'm wrong. Nobody's marshaling arguments in
No.
print saying, oh, you're far better with a weak first line. Second and third lines will catch all that bad things that are going on out there. Then you say, well, how did you decide how much second and third line you're going to engage to compensate for the weak first line in a world that's changing every month?
Well, no, and nobody's willing to debate you, Tim, because you're right. you know, and the problem is they're just not willing to accept it or come along with it. So, that's why I'm trying to help out and push. I haven't been doing it nearly as long as you have, but I'm going to keep pushing and keep being the contrarian for people to, pull their head out of their ass and actually think about this in the right way and realize that, like you said, most of these other centric approaches, you can program the software to do it. But if you're really going to have the clarity and do the things that require the human judgment and the actual human interaction, right, of actually being able to be intelligent emotionally with people and know how to use things like psychology and influence to actually develop relationships and work through some of this stuff, yeah, the machines are going to take over.
Yeah, and where's the cognitive biases at work on the management side, and
Oh
can
man,
can
yeah.
I sort of gently expose some of them and get a better appreciation? But I don't like to be all negative. I have to give kudos to Richard Chambers, CEO, president of the IIA. He nominated me and put me on his 10 thought leaders of the decade. And the write-up, though, says every profession needs somebody like Tim that is continually harassing the profession, that there's got to be better ways to do it. And I think one of the earmarks or one of the hallmarks of being a professional should be relentlessly looking, is there better ways to actually satisfy what our customers want? And if the answer is, well, they haven't bothered to tell us, well, you better take the time and try and get it out of them. Because
Yeah.
I'll tell you, if your customer doesn't know exactly what it is they want you for, you are very vulnerable to getting rid of.
Yep. Well, exactly. Well, Tim, thank you. Thank you. Love talking to you. So I'll probably have to have you back in the future as well. But I really appreciate, like I said at the beginning, you have been one of those people in the profession that's always been kind of, pushing it and asking us how we can do things different. It's meant a lot to me. I mean, again, in my development as well, kind of hearing what you've been saying and thinking about it and doing my own research and my own playing with it. But, I keep coming back to the same thing where it's like, Tim, you're right, man. That's why I'm saying the same thing too. So,
So, I would encourage those of you that even if you only like some of the ideas, consider following me on LinkedIn. I've got a LinkedIn discussion group called Objective-Centric Risk and Certainty Management. All my posts are there. You become a member of it. You can read 2 years of radical thinking about it. And a lot of my posts, I'm just as focused on the second line as I am on the third line. And all of it, though, is promoting the business case for strong first line, objective-centric, demand-driven assurance.
Yep.
That's
Yep,
the
exactly.
theme.
That's a theme. Well,
Thanks a lot, Jason.
I'll link up in the show notes for that. And just again, since this is usually audio, I'll put it in the show notes too. But what's the website, the best website for people? Because I know you referred to the resources
Well,
for
that's
them to be able to go back.
www.riskoversight.solutions.com.
Risk Oversight Solutions. All right, so go out and download some of the stuff. Ask to join the LinkedIn group and keep the discussion going. Well, Tim, thanks again, man.
Appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity. You have a good one.
Thanks, you too. And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Jamming with Jason. Keep on rocking in the audit world. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you later on the next show. If you'd like to earn continuing professional education for listening to today's episode, head on over to C-Risk Academy at ondemand.criskacademy.com. And that's C as in the letter C, riskacademy.com. Not only do you get a CPE certificate, but you also will have access to the video version of today's show. The views and opinions expressed on this show are that of the individuals and not of their respective organizations.